Going into round 10 of the Tata Steel Masters tournament, Anish Giri led the field by a half a point. He had a tough game against Sergei Karyakin, who really prepares excellently, and indeed Giri got nowhere and that game ended in a draw. So let's see what happened to the two players who are just behind Giri, chasing him. So Magnus Carlsen and, first of all, Shahriar Mamedyarov. So Mamedyarov had black against Svidler, and it was a pretty regular start to the game. So from an English we've gone into a so-called Ragozin variation. I rather like this with black. It's very solid, you have a nice pawn centre, but it's a little bit more dynamic than the usual Queen's Gambit with Bishop e7. Now Svidler repeated the line that he'd played against Ho Ifan a couple of days before. He played Bishop f4. And Ifan played castles, and this was a very regular opening. A very regular position was reached, typical pawn structure, very solid. Svidler eventually won, but I think, it was a very balanced position really. But instead of that, Mamedyarov sought to try to stir things up right from the word go, knight e4. So putting pressure on the knight on c3, exploiting this pin. Now the normal move here is just to play rook c1. And then, black has various options, maybe castles. You could also play c5 and try to play very aggressively, bringing the queen to a5. But anyway, rook c1 is the normal move here. But instead Svidler played queen a4 check. Now that forces knight c6 to protect the bishop. Now white still has to defend the knight on c3, therefore rook c1. Mamedyarov castled. g3 from Svidler, and now Mamedyarov reacted very well indeed. That queen is actually rather oddly placed on a4. It's not exactly clear what the purpose was of queen a4 check, because the knight in this case isn't too badly placed on c6. There are other lines of the Ragozin where it's appropriate, but in this case you can see the queen is miles away from the king side, and Mamedyarov seized the initiative with g5, hitting the bishop, and then f5. So while the queen is on the other side of the board, go for it. And also you can see that black is already ahead in development. He's already castled, so this rook behind the f-pawn looks very dangerous. White's king is stuck in the middle for the moment. Well, Svidler played bishop g2, and Mamedyarov, he is in his element. He loves attacking. He's a very good technical player, but his real forte is attacking. As a kid, he played absolutely brilliant attacking games, and here he just goes for it. Now, Svidler should probably duck the bishop back to d2, but instead he played an inaccuracy. He took on f4. Mamedyarov exchanged bishop for knight, recaptured on f4, and so Svidler put the bishop back on d2. Now the reason it was inaccurate to exchange is because Mamedyarov simply played king h8 here, with the idea in some cases of just bringing the rook over to g8 to attack that bishop, and that is already extremely unpleasant for white. Svidler certainly cannot entertain any ideas of castling kingside here. That would be catastrophic, particularly with the queen way over across the other side of the board. Now, this is a difficult position for white. I mean, maybe in order to answer rook g8, maybe one should play h4 with the idea, in some cases, bishop h3. But this is unpleasant. Svidler thought for 35 minutes here. A very long think, and as is so often the case when players think for such a long time, he actually came up with a dreadful move. He played queen b3. Well, I think any of us can see that this invites the knight to come to f5, attacking the queen, knight to come to a5, attacking the queen, and then into c4, which is exactly what Mamedyarov did. So, and the situation has just got even worse for white. So who knows what Svidler had in mind, but well, he'll be kicking himself after the game. So the bishop in big trouble here. Svidler played rook d1 and rook g8, attacking the bishop. And now there are problems. Well, for example, what happens if rook g1? Well, we can play bishop h3, exchange rooks on g1, and then queen h4. It's as simple as that. And how on earth does white defend the f2 square? Very simple. Or, okay, what about bringing the bishop back to f1? Well, it's pretty miserable. Bishop f5, developing with gain of tempo. And then we can take here. Now, you can just take on d2 and well, you have an absolutely crushing attack here. This is just dreadful. Or, here's a very nice variation. If queen takes d2, bishop e4, and that wins the rook, because f3 allows queen h4 mate. I mean, this is horrible. Or, if you want to be really cruel, instead of taking here, you could just play knight e3 and win that rook, because obviously pawn takes knight would be met by queen h4 checkmate. It's catastrophic. Svidler, in answer to rook g8, attacking the bishop, played knight e5. That got taken. Now, obviously, if pawn takes here, then just rook takes bishop. So Svidler played bishop takes knight. And now an excellent move from Mamedyarov. He's in his element. Didn't take him long to play queen g5, threatening queen g1, followed by checkmate on the back rank. It's completely lost for white. Completely lost. Bishop f4 from Svidler. Queen takes f4. Bishop d5. And after bishop f5, Svidler resigned. Well, he's a piece down, and it's just a thunderous attack. Let's finish the game off. So, for example, queen d2, knight d3 check. When that gets taken, then rook e8. And if the bishop goes in the way, then queen f3, hitting this one. Well, you can take here, but then we take that, and that's catastrophic. And let's finish with a checkmate. After, let me see, check, yes, king f1 allows bishop h3 mate. I think we should leave it there. Well, after the game, Mamedyarov said that against Giri, he said that, well, he played very quietly, and he said he said I played very boring chess and I lost immediately. He said today he wanted to play actively, and well, look what happens. He was really in his element. He is such a dangerous attacking player. Let's turn to Magnus Carlsen. He was playing white against Wesley So. Now, this is a very long game. I'm not going to go through the whole game, but we join the struggle after 22 moves. You can see Carlsen's king is in the middle of the board. He played quite an enterprising opening. And now he played rook he1, so preparing obviously to bring this rook into the game. Maybe he wants to duck back with the king, maybe even come forward, depends how black plays. Wesley played f6 to try to open the position, because if this is exchanged off, then suddenly, well, this is attacked. You can see the king doesn't look too clever in the middle of the board. But Magnus replied instantly against this. He played pawn to e6. This is an excellent move, excellent pawn sacrifice. Wesley took it, and now king f3. Now, the king is actually really well placed on f3. It's better than f1. On f3, this actually prepares for an endgame where the king is tucked in nicely behind the f-pawn and can protect the f-pawn as well. But first of all, we're a long way from an endgame. So first of all, the rook attacks the queen comes back. Now, you can see that by giving up that pawn, that black still has an f-pawn on f6, so the f-file is closed. So that means that the king is quite safe on f3. And Magnus didn't rush things. He's a pawn down, but he's very calm here. He just brought his rook into the middle of the board. White has a little bit of pressure here. It's such a typical Magnus position. You know that if you fed this into a computer, it would probably say, well, equal. But this is a tricky position because these light squares around black's king are very sensitive, really vulnerable. You know, this bishop would love to sit on g6. It gets there in a second. And this extra pawn really doesn't mean anything at all. I'm still slightly surprised that Wesley didn't play f5 here, actually. Now, I think, well, the reply would either be bishop c4 or bishop c2. I mean, Magnus is going to win this pawn back, but it feels right to put the pawn on f5. But Wesley played rook d8, queen e3, he hits the bishop, bishop d6, and now bishop g6. Yeah, that's where the bishop wants to be. Controls the e8 square, so black can't trade rooks. If black managed to trade all the rooks, then the opposite colour bishop ending would just be a draw. But also, with the bishop around black's king, it makes the king's position feel very uncomfortable. f5 from Wesley. Okay, he gets it in now, and that seems reasonable. Gives, you know, perhaps the rook the opportunity to hit the bishop here. And I thought that h4 would be played here, and just lock that bishop in on h5. But no, Magnus played it differently. He went straight for an endgame. Very interesting play. I mean, one reason to do this would be that, I mean, now his king really doesn't have any difficulties. But anyway, he's just going to try and recover this pawn. He's also looking at this pawn as well. Bishop c5 from Wesley. And again, I thought h4 here, just to lock that bishop in on h5. I mean, maybe Magnus just felt that black would keep the extra pawn. I mean, white will probably get this one back, but maybe he felt it wasn't enough to win. So it's very, very difficult in these kind of technical positions to know during the game, even after the game, which is best. But Magnus went for rook e5. I think one thing about Magnus is that, you know, he doesn't torture himself over these kind of tricky positions, tricky technical decisions. You know, he has a very clear idea of what he wants to achieve, and that puts more pressure on his opponent, of course. So rook e5, he's just recovering pawns now, but he still has a positional advantage. His king is better than black's king, and these light squares are still rather sensitive. Rook d5. So Magnus is a pawn up, and it's a clear extra pawn. Opposite colour bishops on the board, so if all the rooks are traded, black would have excellent drawing chances, but long way from doing that. Now, if white could get in this idea of h5 and bishop g6, life would be very good. But g6. And now, Magnus played bishop g4. It's a very provocative move. Could be bishop h3 is better. It's hard to say, but we'll see why in a second. But bishop g4. He wanted to provoke h5 because that pawn, now it's on a light square, could conceivably be a weakness later on. but we'll see there is a slight drawback to this. So black getting out of the pin here and wants to trade rooks. This is reasonable. Magnus declines the offer. Very sensible. So the two rooks now attacking the bishop. Bishop e5. Of course, there's a pin, so that the bishop can't be taken. And rook b4, attacking this pawn. Now, this is starting to get tricky, because if b6, then we can give a check, and that rook can't interpose because of rook e4 winning a piece. So, well, Wesley decided time for counterplay. g5. So he's attacking pawn here, but also looking to play g4. Now Magnus could take the pawn on b7 check, but I'm guessing that he thought that white would have reasonable drawing chances in this endgame. But again, it's one of those technical decisions. It's very hard to determine what the best move is. So he played g3 straight away, so that keeps a hold of the pawn on f4. And b6, preventing rook takes b7. And now rook d7 check. So if the rook interposes, then once again white wins that piece. So king f8. White could take on a7 here, but instead Magnus went for rook h7, and he gives up a piece. Well, that's one way to avoid opposite colour bishops. And we have a really difficult endgame. 3 pawns for the bishop, and this rook is very annoying indeed for Wesley. Now around about here I think he should have played bishop e7. I mean, maybe he was worried about this endgame, but I think this should be a draw. I mean, this is very hard to prove, but I think that's actually a draw. But instead he went for king g8. But after this, Magnus got pawn number 4. And, well, the game went on a long time, but basically Magnus made no mistake. With 4 pawns to the piece and control, that's very important. That was enough to win. So Magnus and Mamedyarov catch up Giri. That's the story of the round. So, well, I mean, it was an incredibly exciting day. Apart from Shakiri and Mamedyarov defeating Svidler and Carlsen defeating Wesley. So Anand beat Garwin Jones, Kramnik beat Matlakov, the other games are drawn. So that leaves Giri, Carlsen and Mamedyarov on 7 points, Kramnik just behind on 6.5, and then Anand on 6. Now with 3 rounds to go, really any of those players could still win. Round 11, crunch round, it's going to be on Friday. Mamedyarov plays Carlsen, and Giri plays black against Caruana. It really is incredibly tight. So 3 games still to play. If you want all the details of this round, please do catch up on chessbase.com for detailed analysis. Thanks for watching.